My name is Emily, and if you had met me a year ago, you would have seen the same thing everyone else saw. The quiet daughter, the dependable one, the girl who always said yes, the girl who never fought back. That is exactly why my siblings chose me first, when our Aunt Margaret began to fade. They said, Emily, you're the calm one. You're the one she trusts. You should handle the paperwork. At the time, I believed them. My Aunt Margaret had raised us more like a second mother than a relative. She never had children of her own. She worked hard her whole life, paid for our school clothes when our parents were broke, sent birthday cards with cash tucked inside, and somehow remembered everyone's favorite meal, even after her memory started slipping. When she was 82, the forgetting became serious. First, she would leave the stove on. Then she would repeat the same sentence 5 times. Then she forgot my name one afternoon and looked at me like I was a stranger in her own kitchen. That was the day my heart broke. We took her to the doctor, and after several appointments, the words came slowly and coldly. Dementia. Not a sudden collapse, not a single event, just a slow, cruel fading. And that was when my siblings, Daniel and Brooke, suddenly became very interested in Aunt Margaret's finances. At first, they acted concerned. Daniel would say, "We just need to make sure everything is organized." Brooke would say, "We should all have access in case anything happens." But I noticed the way their eyes changed whenever they talked about her house, her accounts, or the old family trust she had built over decades. I noticed how they asked questions that had nothing to do with her care and everything to do with what she owned. Aunt Margaret heard it too. One evening after everyone had left, she sat in her recliner, staring at her hands. Then she looked at me and said softly, "Emily, I'm not confused about people. I know who loves me, and I know who loves my money." I remember swallowing hard. She reached for my hand. "If I ever stop being able to protect myself, I need you to protect me." That was the moment everything changed. A few weeks later, after discussing it with her doctor and attorney, Aunt Margaret signed legal documents appointing me as her power of attorney and naming me as her legal guardian if the court ever needed to step in. It was not glamorous. It was not emotional in the movie sense. It was just paperwork, signatures, and a heavy responsibility that suddenly sat on my shoulders like a mountain. I did not celebrate it. I understood what it meant. It meant I had to act in her best interest. Not my siblings' interest. Not my own. Only hers. And that, right there, became the problem. Because the second Daniel and Brooke realized they were no longer the ones in control, their sweetness disappeared. At family dinners, they started making comments. Brooke would smile and say, "Emily's always been the controlling one, huh?" Daniel would laugh and add, "Yeah, now she gets to play boss." They made it sound like I had somehow stolen something from them. But I had not taken anything. I had been given a duty to protect a woman who could no longer fully protect herself. Then came the pressure. They wanted Aunt Margaret to update her will. They wanted her to simplify the accounts. They wanted her to gift them money for future planning. Future planning. That was their favorite phrase. One night, Daniel cornered me in the hallway after dinner. He leaned in and said, "You know, Emily, you're really making this harder than it needs to be. We're family. We should all have a say." I looked at him and said, "She's the one who should have a say. And right now, I'm the one making sure no one takes advantage of her." His expression hardened. "You think you're better than us now?" That was the first time I saw the greed in its purest form. Not loud, not dramatic, just ugly. A person looking at an elderly woman and seeing a bank account instead of a human being. After that, things got worse. Brooke began visiting Aunt Margaret alone and calling me afterward, saying things like, "She seemed confused today. Maybe you should let us help manage things." Then she would casually mention needing access to one of the accounts, or asking if Aunt Margaret had already changed the beneficiary, or wondering if the house should stay in the family. The house, that old white house on Maple Street, was where every Christmas had ever happened, where we had eaten too much pie, where Aunt Margaret had ironed school uniforms and patched knees and listened to teenage heartbreaks with the patience of a saint. To them, it was property. To me, it was a lifetime. I started documenting everything. Every phone call. Every request. Every suspicious comment. I spoke with Aunt Margaret's attorney. I reviewed the power of attorney documents line by line. I made sure her bank had the correct paperwork. I informed her care facility that no financial discussions were to happen with anyone but me. I set up alerts for any unusual transactions. I made sure her accounts were protected, her bills were paid, and her medical wishes were respected. And then my siblings got angry. Not because I was doing something wrong, because I was doing my job too well. That's when Daniel tried to go behind my back. I found out he had called the bank pretending to be helping with family matters. He asked questions about transfers. He tried to push for access, but because I had already filed the proper legal forms, the bank refused him. He called me furious. "How dare you freeze us out?" I said, "I didn't freeze you out. I protected her assets from unauthorized access." "You're paranoid." "No," I said. "I'm prepared." Brooke was even worse. She showed up at the house with printed papers she claimed Aunt Margaret had agreed to in a confused moment. I looked at the pages. They were incomplete, carelessly drafted, full of wording that would have shifted control away from Aunt Margaret and into a family shared management arrangement that only benefited them. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "These papers are not valid for what you are trying to do." Brooke crossed her arms. "You always act like you're the only responsible one." I looked straight at her. "No, I act like the one person here who remembers this is about her, not you." That afternoon, Aunt Margaret was resting when I sat at the kitchen table with my lawyer on the phone. The legal advice was clear. As her appointed guardian and power of attorney, I had the authority to block any unauthorized attempts to access her finances or manipulate her property. I could notify the bank, the attorney, and, if necessary, the court. I could request oversight. I could challenge suspicious behavior. I could place strict safeguards around her money and assets. And that is exactly what I did. I filed the necessary notices. I revoked any informal permissions my siblings had assumed existed. I told the bank to reject all requests from Daniel and Brooke unless they came through me in writing and within the law. I secured copies of everything. I made sure Aunt Margaret's home, accounts, and healthcare directives were all protected from pressure and fraud. That may sound cold, but let me tell you something. When people smell money, they become dangerous. And when an elderly woman cannot clearly defend herself, help becomes a weapon. The next week, my siblings started spreading stories. They told relatives I was controlling. They told cousins I was keeping Aunt Margaret isolated. They said I had taken over because I wanted her money. I heard all of it, and I kept going, because Aunt Margaret was still alive, still aware, in her own way, still capable of understanding love, fear, and betrayal. One afternoon, I sat with her while sunlight came through the curtains. She was holding a teacup with both hands, staring at the steam. Then she said, very quietly, "They're angry because they thought I would be easy." My throat tightened. She looked at me with tired eyes. "You know what hurts most, Emily? It's not that they want the house. It's that they stopped seeing me before I was even gone." I had no words for that, because it was true. People often think betrayal is always loud. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes betrayal is a smile across the dinner table, a family meeting, a fake concern, a signature requested at the right emotional moment, a confused elder being told, "Just trust us." That is how greed works. It dresses itself up as love. Then came the breaking point. Brooke and Daniel arrived one evening together, both dressed too nicely, both holding that same fake calm I had learned to fear. Daniel said, "We need to talk." I said, "We are talking." He exhaled sharply. "We think Aunt Margaret should move in with Brooke so things are easier." I almost laughed, because the lie was so obvious it was insulting. Brooke added, and we think the house should be sold. That way the money can be divided fairly. There it was. The real plan. Sell the house. Split the money. Move the woman out of the home she loved. Call it fairness. I looked at them both and said, Aunt Margaret is not a package to be relocated. She is not a liquid asset. She is a person with medical needs, emotional attachments, and legal protections. Daniel's face reddened. You're making this a bigger deal than it is. No, I said, standing up slowly. You made this a bigger deal when you tried to use her decline to get what you wanted. Brooke pointed at me. You think you're some kind of hero because you read a few legal papers? I took a deep breath. Then I said the words that changed everything. I am the guardian named to protect her. I have already blocked unauthorized access. And if either of you tries again, I will have the court involved immediately. Silence. That room went so still I could hear the refrigerator humming in the next room. Daniel stared at me like he had not expected resistance. Brooke's lips parted but no sound came out. I went on. I have every record of your calls, your visits, your requests, and your attempts to pressure her. The bank knows, her attorney knows, her doctor knows, and if necessary, a judge will know too. Daniel's voice dropped low. You would really do that to your own family? I looked at him and said, You stopped acting like family when you started treating her like a paycheck. Neither of them had an answer, and that is the moment I knew they were not coming back from this. Over the next several days, the consequences finally began to land. The bank denied their attempts to access information. The attorney confirmed that any informal demands had no legal weight. The care facility restricted their unsupervised contact, and the court received a full report of everything. Greed hates paperwork. It hates evidence. It hates boundaries. Because once everything is documented, manipulation loses its power. Daniel called me again, this time sounding less angry and more desperate. You're seriously going to ruin us over this? I stood in the kitchen looking at Aunt Margaret's favorite bowl of apples on the counter and I said, No, Daniel. You ruined this the moment you chose money over mercy. I'm just making sure you don't ruin her too. That was the last time he tried to bully me. Brooke stopped calling altogether. And Aunt Margaret, she grew calmer. Not because her memory got better. It didn't, but because the house felt safe again. Her medication was managed properly. Her bills were paid. Her bank statements were reviewed. Her wishes were followed. And no one could slip a signature past her or pressure her into giving away what she had spent her life building. One afternoon, I was helping her fold towels when she looked up and smiled. You were always the brave one, she said. I shook my head. No, Aunt Margaret. I just finally got tired of being quiet. She laughed softly, then reached for my hand. That small moment meant more to me than any inheritance ever could. Because in the end, this was never really about money. It was about dignity. It was about a woman who gave everything and deserved peace. It was about drawing a line when family forgot how to love. And it was about learning that being calm does not mean being weak. Some people thought I would fold. Some people thought I would let my siblings pressure me into sharing control. Some people thought kindness meant saying yes to everything. They were wrong. Kindness without boundaries becomes a door for abuse. So I closed the door. Legally. Calmly. Completely. And the same people who tried to manipulate an elderly woman for personal gain ended up facing the one thing they never expected. Consequences. Real honest. Paper trail ones. Court-backed ones. The kind that do not disappear when you smile and pretend you meant well. If you are listening to this story, I want you to remember something. Elderly people are not problems to solve. They are not obstacles to money. They are not confused little figures to push aside when they become inconvenient. They are human beings. They remember more than people think. And even when they cannot fight for themselves, someone should. I became that someone, not because I wanted power, but because I loved her too much to let greed win. And honestly, that love was stronger than anything my siblings brought to the table. Stronger than lies. Stronger than manipulation. stronger than money. Because money can be fought over. But respect? Respect is either there or it is not. And the day my siblings chose greed over family, they lost more than access to assets. They lost the trust of the woman who had loved them all their lives. And they lost me, not as a sister, not as a witness, but as the person who would ever again protect their excuses from the truth. And that, to me, was the real inheritance. After that night, something in the family shifted forever. No one said it out loud at first. Families rarely do. They prefer silence when the truth is too ugly to face. But I could feel it in every room, in every phone call, in every awkward pause when my name came up. I was no longer the quiet one they could lean on. Now I was the one standing between them and what they wanted. And that made me dangerous in their eyes. The next morning, I found 3 missed calls from Brooke and 2 messages from Daniel. Brooke's text said, "We need to fix this before it gets worse." Daniel said, "You are making a huge mistake." I stared at those words for a long time. A huge mistake. That was what they called protecting our aunt. That was what they called refusing to let them pressure a vulnerable woman into giving away her home. I did not answer either of them right away. Instead, I drove to Aunt Margaret's attorney's office. I remember sitting in that polished conference room, my hands folded in my lap, trying to stay calm while the attorney explained everything one more time. He was a serious man with a steady voice, the kind of man who never wasted words. He looked at the file, then at me, and said, "You did the right thing." Those 7 words lifted a weight off my chest I had not even realized I was carrying. He continued, "When someone is acting under a valid power of attorney, they are legally required to act in the best interest of the person they represent. That means protecting assets, protecting dignity, and preventing exploitation. What your siblings attempted could easily be viewed as undue influence if it were pursued further. Undue influence." That phrase stayed in my mind, because that was exactly what they had been trying to do. They were not asking. They were not helping. They were applying pressure. They were wearing my aunt down, hoping her confusion would become their shortcut. The attorney then helped me prepare a stronger plan. We reviewed all existing documents. We updated the care instructions. We made sure every financial institution had copies of the legal paperwork. We added a written note that no one besides me could authorize access to her accounts. We made sure any major decisions required proper review. It felt strange, sitting there with all that paperwork spread out in front of me because it made everything so official, so final. This was no longer just a family disagreement. It was a legal wall, a boundary written in ink. And honestly, it needed to be. Because family greed does not stop when you ask nicely. It stops when it meets consequences. When I came home, Aunt Margaret was napping in her chair. The television was on low volume, and the afternoon light was warm on the carpet. For a second, everything looked peaceful. But even peace can feel fragile when you know how close it came to being broken. I sat beside her and watched her breathe. Then she woke up slowly, looked at me, and smiled that soft, tired smile she had always given me when she knew I was carrying too much. "Did they come again?" she asked. I hesitated, then nodded. Her eyes closed for a moment. "I'm sorry," she whispered. My heart cracked all over again. I touched her hand and said, "Do not ever apologize for their behavior." She opened her eyes and looked at me with something like sadness, something like shame. I raised a family that argues over what I own instead of asking what I need. That sentence hurt because it was so honest. I squeezed her hand and said, "You raised people. They made their own choices." She looked at me for a long time after that. Then she said, "You stayed." And that was when I almost cried, because that was the truth of it. I stayed. Not because it was easy, not because I enjoyed the conflict, not because I wanted control. I stayed because love is not always loud. Sometimes love is sitting in the hard chair, doing the boring paperwork, making the difficult calls, and saying no when everyone else wants you to say yes. That week, Daniel came by unannounced. I was in the kitchen making soup for Aunt Margaret when the doorbell rang. The sound made me tense immediately. I opened the door, and there he stood, hands in his pockets, trying to look calm. But I could see the strain in his face. He said, "Can we talk?" I said, "About what?" He looked past me into the house. "About Mom." "She is not your mother," I interrupted before I could stop myself. He froze. I had never spoken to him like that before. Not once in my life. He blinked, then muttered, "You know what I mean." "No," I said. "I really do not think I do." He shifted uncomfortably. "Look, this is getting ridiculous. People are talking. You're making it sound like we're criminals." I folded my arms. "Then stop acting like one." His jaw tightened. He looked at me with that wounded expression people use when they know they have been caught but still want sympathy for being called out. "We were just trying to keep things in the family," he said. I gave a short, humorless laugh. "In the family?" I repeated. "You mean the part where you tried to get access to her accounts without permission? Or the part where Brooke brought those papers over to make a transfer look harmless? Or the part where both of you pushed her while her memory was failing?" He flinched, but only for a second. Then he said, "She wouldn't even notice half of it." That sentence was the ugliest thing I had heard all year. It was like hearing a mask fall to the floor. Eyes stared at him, stunned by how casually he had said it. Not because he believed it, but because he thought it was acceptable to admit. "She wouldn't notice half of it," I repeated quietly. He looked away, maybe realizing too late how horrible he sounded. I stepped back from the doorway and said, "Get off the porch, Daniel." He looked at me. "What?" "You heard me. If you are here to guilt me, manipulate me, or pressure me, then this conversation is over." He took a breath like he was about to argue, but then he noticed the expression on my face. Maybe for the first time he realized I was not bluffing. So he said, "You've changed." I nodded once. Yes, I finally did. And I closed the door. My hands were shaking after that, but I still finished the soup. Because life does not stop just because betrayal shows up at your front door. The next days were quieter, but the quiet felt tense. Brooke stopped calling altogether, but she started posting vague things on social media about family drama and selfish people who hide behind paperwork. She never used names, but she did not need to. The message was clear enough. I did not respond. The best thing about legal protection is that it does not need to shout. It simply exists. And when it is done correctly, it speaks for itself. Still, I knew I needed to be careful. Aunt Margaret's safety was not only about money. It was about trust, health, and dignity. So I arranged additional oversight through her care team. I spoke directly with her doctor about what to watch for. I made sure her medications were reviewed regularly. I asked for extra documentation for any major changes in her condition. I was learning something painful, but necessary. Protecting someone you love is a responsibility that never really ends. It evolves. It deepens. It demands more of you than you thought you had to give. There were nights I sat in my car in the driveway after taking Aunt Margaret to appointments, just breathing through the stress before I could walk back inside. There were moments I wanted to scream at my siblings, to ask them how they could look at her and see dollars instead of decades of sacrifice. There were moments I wanted my old family back, the version of us before money made them greedy and made me the enemy. But wishing for that version of the family did nothing. The truth was already here. And one afternoon, the truth arrived in a very public way. The attorney called me and told me the court had scheduled a review because of the concerns I had documented. He explained that some of the family's actions had drawn attention. Nothing dramatic yet, but enough that the matter was no longer just a private disagreement. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed after that call, staring at the floor. Not because I was afraid, because I was tired. So tired. Tired of being the one who had to make the hard choices. Tired of being the one who had to prove I was not the problem. Tired of loving people who only understood love when it was convenient for them. That evening, Aunt Margaret found me in the kitchen with my head in my hands. She asked, "What happened?" I looked up and told her the truth. They're trying to challenge everything. Her face went still. Not frightened, not surprised, just quietly devastated. I moved closer and said, "But they won't win." She nodded slowly, but I could see the sadness in her eyes. It was not just about losing control of her finances. It was about losing the illusion that her children and nieces and nephews were all working together out of love. Sometimes the hardest thing in the world is accepting that the people you trusted have been measuring your worth by what you own. A few days later, Brooke came by again, this time not alone. She brought her husband. That should have told me enough already. He was polite in the fake, too smooth way people are when they think being calm makes them look innocent. He smiled too much. He used the word fair a lot, and every time he spoke, it sounded like he was trying to sell me something I did not want. "We just want what's best for Margaret," he said. I met his eyes and said, "Then that is simple. Support her care, respect her wishes. Stop pushing for control." He smiled thinly. "We think the assets should be managed differently." There it was again. Managed differently. They never said steal. They never said take. They used soft words. They used careful words. But I knew what they meant. Brooke stepped forward and said, "We're not asking for everything, just a fair share." I looked at her and asked, "A fair share of what? Of the home she built? Of the savings she earned? Of the safety she depends on?" Brooke's eyes flashed. "You act like we're vultures." I did not answer immediately. Then I said, "Then stop circling like one." That landed hard. Her husband's face changed. Brooke's lips tightened. For a second, I thought she might actually yell, but instead she did something worse. She began crying, not full sobbing, just enough tears to make it look believable. "You always did judge me," she said softly. "You always think you're better than me." I watched her carefully. I had grown up with Brooke. I knew every version of her. I knew when she was genuinely hurt and when she was performing it like a skill. And this was a performance. I said, "I do not think I am better than you. I think I am more honest than you right now." She stared at me. Her husband placed a hand on her shoulder as if this were some sad family conversation, not an attempted pressure campaign. Then he said, "This doesn't have to become legal." I let out a slow breath. "It already is legal," I said. "That's the part you keep forgetting." After they left, I sat at the table for a long time in complete silence. I felt drained, hollow, angry, hurt. And then, underneath all of that, something else began to rise. Resolve. Because I understood something very clearly by then. They were not going to stop trying just because I was firm. They were going to keep testing every boundary until the boundary tested them back. So I made the decision to stop being polite about the truth. I would not be cruel. I would not be dramatic. But I would be direct. The next family gathering, I came prepared. Not with anger. With facts. Not with speeches. With records. When everyone sat down in Aunt Margaret's living room, the air already felt heavy. There were cups of tea nobody touched, cookies nobody ate, and all the usual fake smiles that show up when family knows a storm is about to break. Daniel was there. Brooke was there. 2 cousins showed up, probably expecting a normal update. And Aunt Margaret sat in her chair by the window, looking small but steady, like a queen in a room full of people who had forgotten how to behave. I stood near the fireplace and said, "I want to be very clear before anyone starts talking. There will be no more pressure on Aunt Margaret. There will be no private requests. There will be no financial discussions unless they go through the proper legal channels. and there will be no more attempts to manipulate her by making her feel guilty. Daniel scoffed. Brooke looked away. One cousin shifted uncomfortably. I went on, my voice calm and even. I have full responsibility to act in her best interest. That means protecting her assets, protecting her medical care, and protecting her from coercion. That is not up for debate. Daniel finally muttered, "You're enjoying this." I turned to him. "No," I said. "I am surviving it." That shut him up. Then I looked around the room and added something I had needed to say for a very long time. Everyone in this family should be ashamed that this woman had to appoint someone to defend her from her own relatives. The room went dead silent. Aunt Margaret bowed her head, and for a moment, I thought the truth might actually matter. I thought maybe someone would apologize. Maybe someone would finally say, "You're right. We crossed a line." But instead, Daniel stood up. He grabbed his jacket and said, "Fine. Do it your way. See how far your precious morality gets you." Then he walked out. Brooke followed a second later. No apology. No accountability. Just anger from the people who had lost the ability to control the outcome. And strangely, that was the moment I felt peace. Not because the conflict was over. It was not. But because I had stopped waiting for them to become decent. That expectation had been hurting me more than their behavior. That evening, after everyone left, Aunt Margaret looked at me and said, "You did not have to carry this alone." I sat beside her. "I know," I said softly, "but I wanted you to be safe more than I wanted to be comfortable." She nodded, and her hand found mine again. "Then I am grateful," she whispered. I do not know how to explain what that felt like. It was not a grand victory. It was not applause. It was a quiet moment with an old woman whose trust still meant everything. And in that quiet moment, I understood that protecting someone you love is rarely glamorous. It is often lonely. It is often thankless. That should have been the end of it. At least, that is what I hoped. But family trouble rarely ends cleanly. It does not always leave with a slammed door and a final word. Sometimes it lingers. Sometimes it circles back in quieter, meaner ways. For a while, my siblings kept their distance. No more surprise visits. No more fake concern. No more calling me controlling to my face. And honestly, the silence should have felt like a victory. But it did not. It felt like the pause before another attack. I stayed careful. I checked every statement. I reviewed every notice. I kept every receipt. I documented every decision made for Aunt Margaret's care. Not because I was obsessed, because I had learned something painful. People who try to exploit an elderly person do not always stop when they are told no. Sometimes they simply change tactics. And that is exactly what happened. About 3 weeks later, I got a call from the care facility. The nurse on the phone sounded polite but concerned. "Emily," she said, "we had a visitor here this afternoon asking questions about Margaret's finances and whether she had changed any legal documents recently." My stomach dropped. "Who was it?" I asked. The nurse hesitated. "Your brother Daniel. He said he was helping with family matters." I closed my eyes for a second. Of course it was him. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there in my car for a full minute, just staring at the steering wheel. I was not shocked. I was hurt. There is a difference. Shocked means you did not see it coming. Hurt means you did. And it still found a way to break your heart. I went straight to the facility. When I walked in, Daniel was still there, talking too loudly at the front desk like volume could make him sound important. The second he saw me, he straightened up with that familiar expression of forced innocence. He smiled. "Oh, good, you're here." I said nothing. He gestured toward the receptionist. "I was just asking some basic questions." I looked at him. "About her money." His face tightened. "About her care." "No," I said. "You asked whether she had changed legal documents. That has nothing to do with care." He sighed like I was being difficult again. You are really going to make a scene here? I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You are the one who showed up at her facility asking about her legal affairs after you were already told to stay out of them. He glanced at the receptionist, then back at me. I am her brother, and I am her legal protector, I said. And if you keep pushing, I will make sure every boundary is enforced more strongly. The nurse at the desk had gone very still. Daniel saw that he was losing control of the room. That always made him angry. So he leaned in and said quietly, You think you've won, but you haven't. People are starting to ask why you're so involved. They think maybe you like the power. I almost laughed. That was his new strategy now. If he could not take the assets, he would attack my character. That is what greedy people do when the law stops them. They try to make the protector look suspicious. I looked him in the eye and said, Let them ask. I have the records. I have the paperwork. I have the legal authority. You have excuses. His jaw clenched. He took one step back, then muttered, You've become impossible. I answered calmly, No. I became informed. That day, I asked the facility to add extra notes to Margaret's file. No one could receive private information without confirmation from me. No one could pressure her into signing anything. No one could attempt financial questions without being redirected to her attorney. The more I tightened the structure, the more the truth became obvious. They were not worried about her. They were worried about losing access. And then came the thing I had quietly feared all along. Brooke tried to contact Aunt Margaret directly. Not through me. Not through the attorney. Directly. She sent a handwritten letter. At first, I nearly did not open it. I assumed it would be another guilt trip wrapped in soft words. But something in me knew I needed to see it. So I sat at the kitchen table and read it slowly. At the top, she wrote, Dear Aunt Margaret, I hope you know I only want what is best for you. That sentence alone made my chest tighten. Because I had heard the same kind of words 100 times before, from people who meant the opposite. The letter went on. It was full of sweetness, regret, and carefully placed emotional pressure. She wrote about childhood memories, about family unity, about how unfair things had become, about how hurt she felt being kept away. And then came the line that told me everything. She wrote, If you still love me, please trust me with the house matters. The house matters. Not her care, not her loneliness, not her doctor visits, not her pain. The house. I folded the letter back up and stared at it for a long time. Then I walked into Margaret's room and sat beside her bed. She was awake, propped up with pillows, watching an old game show with the sound low. I handed her the letter and said, Brooke sent this. Margaret took it with a shaky hand. She read it slowly, very slowly. When she finished, she did not cry. She just closed her eyes and sat in silence for a long time. Then she said, They never write unless they want something. I swallowed hard. She turned her head toward me. Did she ask about me? Yes, I said honestly. A little. But mostly she asked you to trust her with the house. Margaret gave a tired little smile. At least she is consistent. I could not help it. I smiled too, even though my eyes burned. Then she looked back at the letter and said, Emily, do you know what hurts most? I shook my head. It is not that they want the money, she said softly. It is that they only remember I exist when they want access to it. That was one of the wisest things I had ever heard, and also one of the saddest. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room and thought about the last year, how it had started, how it had changed, how quickly love can be replaced by greed when people think someone is weak. I thought about all the families in the world dealing with this same kind of pain quietly behind closed doors. The daughter who notices the bank statements, The son who realizes someone is pressuring his father into signing papers. The niece who sees the texts, the sudden gifts, the hidden conversations. The one family member who says, "Wait, something is wrong here." That person is often treated like the problem, because the truth threatens the people who benefit from the lie. A few days after that, we received notice of a scheduled family meeting with the attorney present. I knew exactly what that meant. The final attempt, the final push, the final hope that they could somehow wear me down in a room full of people and make it all seem complicated. It was scheduled for Friday afternoon. That entire morning I felt sick with nerves. Not because I was unsure, because I knew how much could be said in one room when everyone was pretending to be reasonable. I arrived early. The attorney was already there. So was a court-appointed social worker. The social worker was kind but firm, the kind of person who had seen enough family conflict to know how fast it could turn ugly. Then Daniel arrived. Then Brooke. Then, to my surprise, one of our cousins, Lisa, showed up too. Lisa was younger than all of us, but often the quiet observer. She was the kind of person who did not speak until she understood everything. She sat down and looked between all of us, then said, "I am only here because I heard people saying Aunt Margaret's being taken advantage of." No one answered her. The attorney began by reviewing the facts. He explained the legal authority I had been granted. He explained the boundaries around financial access. He explained that any action taken on Aunt Margaret's behalf had to be in her best interest. He explained that attempts to pressure, confuse, or manipulate her could be treated seriously. Daniel tried to interrupt twice. The attorney calmly stopped him both times. Brooke sat there with her arms folded, pretending she was not angry. Then the attorney said, "Before we continue, I want to be very clear. This meeting is not about family preference. It is about the welfare of Mrs. Margaret and the validity of her protections." That sentence changed the tone in the room immediately, because now it was no longer about who felt offended. It was about what was lawful and what was right. Brooke finally spoke. "We are not trying to hurt her," she said, with that familiar tremor in her voice that she used when she wanted to sound emotional but not accountable. "We just think Emily has too much control." The social worker asked, "Too much control over what?" Brooke hesitated, and that hesitation said everything. The social worker nodded slightly, as if she had already heard enough. Daniel jumped in. "We just want transparency." I looked at him and said, "Then be transparent about why you kept asking the facility about her finances." He clenched his jaw. The attorney turned to him. "Did you, or did you not, ask for legal updates and financial status from the facility without authorization?" Daniel hesitated, then said, "I was trying to help." That answer was so weak it nearly made me sad. Trying to help does not mean trying to pry into someone's money. Trying to help does not mean asking what documents they signed. Trying to help does not mean bypassing the person who was legally appointed to protect them. The attorney said nothing for a moment. Then he asked Brooke, "Did you send your aunt a letter requesting trust with the house?" Brooke's face changed instantly. She did not answer right away. And when she finally said, "I was only trying to preserve the family home," even she seemed to hear how bad that sounded. Preserve the family home. That was the kind of phrase people use when they want to sound noble while reaching for the keys. Lisa, the cousin, finally spoke. "Wait," she said, looking from Brooke to Daniel. "So let me understand this. Aunt Margaret is alive, vulnerable, and in care, and instead of making sure she feels safe, you two are mainly talking about the house?" The room went very quiet. Lisa looked disgusted. "You know what that sounds like?" she said. "It sounds like you care more about inheritance than her health." Brooke's cheeks went red. Daniel muttered, "That is not fair." Lisa's voice sharpened. "What is unfair is pressuring an elderly woman because you think her memory makes her an easy target." For the first time in the meeting, I saw Daniel lose his composure. He stood up a little too fast and said, You do not know what you are talking about. Lisa did not move. I know enough, she said. I know who has been showing up when nobody asked. I know who has been making everything about assets. And I know who has been acting like the victim after getting caught. The social worker looked at me then. Emily, she asked gently, have you noticed any ongoing attempts to influence Margaret's decisions? I took a breath. Then I told the truth. Yes, repeatedly. And every time I documented it. The attorney placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies of calls, notes, dates, emails, and records. Not accusation, evidence. Daniel stared at the folder like it had personally betrayed him. Brooke's hands tightened in her lap. The attorney opened the file and calmly read through the documented incidents. As each page was mentioned, the room seemed to shrink around them. Denied access request, unapproved banking inquiry, pressure about house sale, letter requesting trust, facility questions about legal documents, repeated contact attempts after clear boundaries. There was no shouting, no drama, just a steady piling up of facts. And facts are hard to argue with. When the attorney finished, he looked at Daniel and Brooke and said, "The pattern is clear." Brooke's voice broke slightly. "So, what happens now?" The attorney answered simply, "The protections remain in place. Any further attempts to interfere may lead to additional legal consequences." There it was. The thing they had been trying to avoid all along. Consequences. Not emotional consequences. Not family disappointment. Real consequences. The kind that show up on paper. The kind that change access. The kind that close doors. Daniel sat down slowly. For the first time, he looked older than I remembered. Maybe because the game was over and he had no more way to pretend. After the meeting, we walked out separately. No one spoke in the hallway for a while. Then Lisa came up beside me and quietly said, "I am glad you stood firm." I looked at her, exhausted. She added, "A lot of people would have folded because they did not want to become the bad guy." That hit me hard, because that was exactly the part that had been hardest. Not the paperwork, not the calls, not the legal process. The loneliness of being the one who says no. The loneliness of being disliked for doing the right thing. I smiled faintly and said, "I did not want to be the bad guy." Lisa nodded. "You were not." That simple statement almost undid me. Later that evening, I sat beside Aunt Margaret's bed and told her everything had been handled. She listened with half-closed eyes. When I finished, she said, "Did they look ashamed?" I thought about it for a moment. "No," I admitted. "Not enough." She gave a tiny nod. "That is how greed is," she said. "It rarely apologizes properly." I reached for her hand. Then she added, "But they did lose." I looked at her. She smiled that small, weary smile of hers. "And I am still here." That was the heart of it. She was still here. Still alive. Still aware. Still deserving of protection. Still not a line item on anyone's wish list. Still a human being. And because I had held the line, she kept her home, her dignity, and her peace. Not every victory looks dramatic from the outside. Sometimes victory looks like a quiet room, a protected bank account, a locked file, a carré plan, a person sleeping safely in their own bed while the people who try to exploit them are forced to back away. That is what real protection looks like. Not flashy, not loud, but strong, very strong. Months later, the family stopped talking about the house. They stopped asking about signatures. They stopped pretending they had concerns. Because once the legal wall was in place, they could no longer hide behind emotion. And slowly, painfully, they learned that access is a privilege, not a right. As for me, I learned something too. What came next was quieter than the fight itself. And in some ways, that was harder. Because once the shouting stopped, once the meetings were over, once the legal warnings were in place, there was still the long, slow aftermath of betrayal. The part nobody sees. The part where you keep living with people who looked at your heart, your family, your loyalty, and still decided money mattered more. For a while, my siblings acted as though nothing had happened. That was their way of saving face. Daniel sent one short message. Hope you're happy. Brooke sent nothing at all. I stared at Daniel's words for a long time before I finally deleted them. Hope you're happy. That was what he sent me after trying to pressure an elderly woman through the cracks in her memory. That was what he sent me after trying to question legal documents behind my back. That was what he sent me after finding out he could not bully his way through the door anymore. People like that always say the same thing when they lose control. They do not say, I was wrong. They do not say, I am sorry. They say, I hope you feel good about this. As if protecting someone vulnerable is something shameful. As if cruelty is just another opinion. I did not answer him, because the truth was, I was not happy. I was relieved. There is a difference. Happy is what you feel when things are light. Relieved is what you feel when something dangerous finally stops coming at you. And for Aunt Margaret, relief mattered more than anything. She could feel the change even if she could not always remember the details. She could feel the house was calmer. She could feel the tension had lifted. She could feel that no one was trying to corner her anymore. That alone made every difficult conversation worth it. One afternoon, I found her sitting by the window with a quilt over her legs, watching the rain slide down the glass. She looked peaceful. Not perfectly well, not magically healed, but peaceful. I brought her tea and sat down beside her. For a while, neither of us said anything. The room was warm, and the sound of rain made everything feel softer. Then she turned to me and said, You know what I realized? What? I asked. She smiled a little. When people are desperate for money, they become very creative. I laughed quietly, because she said it with such dry honesty that it caught me off guard. Then her expression softened. But you, she said, you never got creative. You just got stronger. That sentence stayed with me, because that was exactly what it had felt like. Not like winning a battle. More like becoming someone I had never needed to be before. Someone firmer. Someone slower to trust. Someone who understood that love without boundaries becomes a trap. A few days later, I got another call from the attorney. This one was not dramatic. No urgent threats. No new emergency. Just an update. The court had reviewed the documentation. The protections remained. The concerns had been taken seriously. And because everything had been done properly, there was no room for anyone to twist the story later. No room for pretending. No room for hidden transfers. No room for last-minute surprises. The law had done what the law is supposed to do when people act in good faith. It had protected the person who could no longer protect herself fully. I should have felt triumphant when I heard that. Instead, I felt tired again. So tired. Because truthfully, the legal side was only half the burden. The other half was grief. No one talks enough about grieving people who are still alive. You grieve the version of your sibling who used to share candy with you in the back seat. You grieve the version of your family that felt safe. You grieve the idea that love would automatically be enough to make people decent. And then, one day, you realize you are not just grieving what happened. You are grieving what never will. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, long after Aunt Margaret had gone to sleep. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. I kept thinking about how easily all of this could have gone differently if my siblings had simply chosen compassion. If they had shown up and asked, "How can we help?" instead of, "What can we get?" If they had looked at Aunt Margaret and seen a person instead of a future payout. But they did not. They chose greed. And greed always tells on itself eventually. It reveals people. It strips away the polite language and leaves behind the real motive. That became painfully clear at the next and final family contact. It happened on a Sunday. I had taken Aunt Margaret to church earlier that morning, and afterward we came home to a stack of mail on the table. One envelope stood out immediately. It was from Brooke. I almost didn't open it, but I did. Inside was a short note. No long speech, no sentimental paragraph, just a few lines. She wrote that she was hurt by the way things had gone, that she never meant for it to become legal, and that she hoped I would eventually understand the family's perspective. The family's perspective. That phrase made me stare at the page for a long time, because the family's perspective was exactly what had nearly cost Aunt Margaret her peace. The family's perspective was what people use when they want their desire to sound bigger than somebody else's safety. I folded the letter once, then twice, and put it in the folder with the rest of the records. Then I walked into Aunt Margaret's room. She was resting with her hands folded on her blanket, watching me quietly as I came in. "Another letter?" she asked. I nodded. She sighed, not surprised at all. Did she apologize? I sat in the chair beside her bed and told her the truth. Not really. She closed her eyes for a moment. That is the hardest part, isn't it? I looked at her. She opened her eyes again and gave a tired little smile. When someone hurts you and still cannot say it plainly. I swallowed hard. Yes, she nodded once. Then you know exactly where you stand. There was something incredibly freeing in that, because clarity, even painful clarity, is better than false hope. After that, I stopped waiting for them to become people they were not. I stopped hoping for the apology that would somehow erase what had happened. I stopped making emotional room for excuses. Instead, I focused on what mattered. Aunt Margaret's comfort, her medication, her meals, her appointments, her favorite music in the afternoon, her tea with too much honey, her stories, even when she repeated them, her laughter, even when it came softly. That became my world. And slowly, peace returned. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. One afternoon, months later, I was helping Aunt Margaret organize a drawer of old photos. We came across a picture of all of us at a summer picnic years ago. In the photo, I was maybe 12, standing in the grass with a shy smile, holding a paper plate. Daniel was laughing. Brooke had her arm around Aunt Margaret. Everyone looked easy, carefree, safe. I held the photo for a long time. Aunt Margaret looked at it and said, "We were not always like this." "No," I said quietly. "We weren't." She touched the corner of the picture with one finger. But that is the trouble with people. You never know which version will stay. I nodded. That was one of the hardest truths of the whole experience. People can be kind for years and still choose selfishness when it matters most. People can share your blood and still betray your trust. People can smile at you and still measure your worth in dollars. And when that happens, you have a choice. You can keep pretending not to see it, or you can protect what is left. I chose protection. No matter how uncomfortable it made me, no matter how misunderstood I became, no matter how many times I was painted as cold. Because cold is not what I became. Careful is what I became. There is a difference. Cold ignores. Careful observes. Cold shuts people out for no reason. Careful builds walls when needed. Cold wants revenge. Careful wants safety. And I wanted Aunt Margaret safe more than I wanted to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding me. That was the real turning point in my life. Not the lawsuit. Not the letters. Not the blocked accounts. The moment I stopped measuring my choices by whether my siblings approved, the moment I accepted that doing the right thing might cost me their love. Because in the end, what is love worth if it disappears the second money enters the room? What is family worth if it only stands beside you when you are useful? What is